Hi, everybody. This is Jay Halfond, greeting you once again on behalf of the Higher Education Administration Program at Boston University's Wheelock College. And I'm very pleased today to have Laurie Pohl with us. Laurie is among her many titles now and in the past, she's currently director of the Higher Education Administration Master's Program and also a full professor of the practice within Wheelock College. But that doesn't begin to tell the story, Laurie. So welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so how do we connect a PhD in chemistry to leadership in enrollment management, and then we can pause at every step in between on the ladder of your career?
Yeah, it's a long and windy road, and it is, I sometimes frame this as I am a great example of the value of a liberal arts education.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Because I think of my learning, my education, a lot about it is transferable skills and knowledge and habits of mind. I really firmly believe that, and that I learned along the way things that I could take with me to my whatever that next position, institution, etc. was, whether by direct application, by amending, by contrast, whatever. So I started off, so I'm a liberal arts grad. I graduated from Albion College in Michigan and graduated early, got a BA in chemistry and a BA in mathematics, and then went off to do a PhD. And what was instructive there is I'm a quasi first generation college student. I had none of the college search process that is so in the news today. And my family, when I said I was going to grad school, they said, well, didn't you already do that?
Yeah,
right. Why aren't you going to get a job? So that was a whole new world, and it wouldn't have been something I thought of until a professor told me I should think about it.
Oh, so one person made a difference.
One person made a huge difference. And my physical chemistry professor said, you really ought to think about grad school. I said, okay, what is that all about? And so we got talking. He helped me think about places and approaches to my search during that process. He says, they'll pay you to go, right? I said, oh, really? So it was really
important to be true,
right? So, that transition for me was not an obvious one. I thought I would go work in a corporate lab somewhere. That's what I did during summers between college. And it opened up a whole new world for me that I hadn't thought about. So I think back on those key moments. That was a really key moment for me. And as I got through my PhD and I was, working at problems, I was helping to run a lab, a shared instrumentation lab at the University of Virginia, doing research, and so kind of thinking, is that all there is? And I think one of the downfalls of STEM in particular, and much PhD education, it gets you to focus very narrow. And it's only when you become a full professor someday that you can go, oh, there's another world out there.
Yes.
When you're secure. And I am a systems thinker. I like looking at how things work together. I ask a lot of questions, and I just was not getting it.
Yeah, it wasn't satisfying enough in that one.
It was not, no.
Yeah.
So my next transition, it was, again, fortuitous in that the University of Virginia had a program that was competitive. You applied to it, and it was to get a one-year fellowship to work in the president's office at UVA and see what administration was all about. And it was no risk. My position was still back in chemistry if I still wanted it. But I think within about a month of that fellowship, when I got it, I knew I was not going back to chemistry.
You fell in love. Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
And it was fascinating. I like seeing the full landscape, seeing how parts fit together. And it was pretty clear that I'd found the right fit for me.
Right.
That's not to say I didn't have, as one of my sisters say to me, well, why did you go get that PhD? I think of it all of a part of that journey.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have been competitive for the fellowship had I not had the PhD.
Yeah. And the fact that you picked UVA to get your PhD turned out to be fortuitous as well, because they happen to have the program that led to the president's office.
Exactly.
So, who would have,
and, and working, at the time when I was in chemistry, I was the first female faculty member in the department. I was a research faculty member, so that was an interesting whole set of experiences I could think on and reflect on, build from. And I think another piece of it is that is where I think I was introduced to issues around not only higher education administration, but also issues of college access, student success, particularly for historically underrepresented students from historically underrepresented populations. That's where my current passion for that was seated.
Okay. So in the president's office, so in a sense, you went right to this kind of broad vantage point of everything relevant, even including personal leadership in terms of what makes a good president, I assume, or not in some cases, but also seeing every possible issue, every sort of town gown, university, legislature, kinds of conflicts, donor issues, I'm sure, everything that comes across the desk of a president. And that must have been a good education.
Yes. Before COVID-19,
I can't remember that.
I could say to you that there probably isn't anything that has surprised me. That I've experienced a lot of what higher education is about, the good, the bad, the ugly. And from crisis management to strategic planning to state government relations, federal relations, personnel management, leadership, etc. And I got to grow up doing that
quickly,
which quickly. I was quite young then, and I ended up being chief of staff to the president for quite a while and chief planning officer. And so I grew up doing, right? So I gained my administrative legs doing work at an executive level.
Was that under one president, or were several?
That was under one president at UVA, John Castine. I would consider him a mentor. And one of the first things he said to me, he says, when I took the fellowship before I'd even worked for him formally, was, I want you to observe me as a leader. I want you to observe me when I do things well, and I want you to observe me when I screw up. And I want you to also come to and reflect on where your natural tendencies are. So how would you have done something different? Or what did you learn out of that situation about yourself as how you might express your own leadership in that situation? So I'm a learner. I love to learn. You could put me back in college, I'd probably be pretty happy. I don't want to be 20. I don't want to be 20 anymore, but I love learning.
Right.
And so I approached all of my jobs as learning opportunities.
Yeah. So why move on past Virginia? It seemed like you had a wonderful vantage point, as I said, and what precipitated that?
Oh goodness. Well,
and to Boston yet.
Yeah. So part of that was, although I had a lot of responsibility, I had no authority.
Right.
So
you weren't line.
I was staff, not line. So I was chief of staff. I had to keep a lot of balls in the air. I had to do a lot of, my fingers were in a lot of pies. But except for the strategic planning piece, which I really did own in the end.
Right.
I wanted to see what I could do with it, with an organization that I was in charge of. Yeah. And part of being line, not staff, is learning to build relationships in order to influence outcomes, you know, without having anything to bring to the table other than the fact that I work for the president.
Right.
Right. So building my credibility, my trust, my integrity, I follow through, as loyal. You know, so what are all those things that I need to do to get things done, absent an organizational structure to support that effort?
A lot of ad hoc things as opposed to stable.
Right.
Keep clicking.
Right. It's a whole different world. I mean, it's not, you don't lose those things or not use those things when you're in a management position, a vice presidency or whatever, but you also have the structure.
Right.
That you both have to enact, use to good end, and support and nurture.
Yeah.
And so there were pieces, and I wasn't going to get that at UVA. I was already kind of at the top.
Yeah.
They weren't going to suddenly make me a dean, you know, or so it just wasn't going to happen.
Typecasted in that role.
I was typecasted in that role. And the other piece, you know, life happens, you know. I had a change in my personal situation. I was time to leave Charlottesville. I'd been there for almost 20 years.
Wow.
And so long story short, Boston, I got there in part because I figured if I don't make it at one place, there's a lot of other opportunity there. Or if I don't find the right fit the first place, it's higher education mecca.
Right.
So that's that transition.
Okay. So now we're at Boston University then.
Yeah.
So you're an associate vice president at that point. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you were in a line operation, but yet you weren't the person in charge of that whole operation at that stage.
Correct.
But well, actually, just to back up a second, enrollment management, and you know, those of us who are familiar with the history of enrollment management, Boston College, etc., you know that it's sort of a superstructure over a series of what used to be independent areas,
right?
With much more of an analytical focus as well, and an attempt to integrate, you know, sort of the front office for student relations at the same time, to do so in a very strategic and analytical way. So that must have been a great education for you to be part of that.
Yeah, so it's when I joined the organization, I joined it in 2003, and it had, at the time, they had just brought together what had been enrollment and what had been student affairs, sort of more traditional dean of student functions, under one vice president.
Right.
And so that was an interesting sort of organizational challenge. And having done some org work before, you know, and done a lot of planning, you need to be intentional. You can't just say, okay, work together. So part of this is how do you knit together these two cultures and get things done. And the second piece was that my specific challenge or opportunity really was to, for the first time, really focus on student retention and student success. That had not been an emphasis at BU at many institutions. And the then vice president wanted someone whose job it was to wake up every day thinking about how to improve student retention and engagement. Okay. And so that's what got me intrigued. She, at the time, was looking for someone who had a wider institutional perspective. Right. She wanted someone who could talk to the faculty. She wanted someone who could connect across academic and student affairs, who could connect with the business office, who kind of could think organizationally. And I think that's what I brought to the table. Yeah. And then I had to, the content knowledge I had to learn was the whole sort of selective admissions world. Financial aid. Well, I knew, so I'd done some work at UVA around financial aid, and I got into admissions a little bit, just a couple of projects I worked on. And so I kind of had I knew the terminology, I knew kind of the lay of the land, but I didn't, functionally know how it worked within an institution. And so that was the sort of content knowledge I had to come up to speed with pretty quickly. Okay. So then you became vice president. Mm-hmm. Which meant you now sort of, you finally had the line manager role in a sense of owning all these things. So what did you own? You owned admissions,
Financial
So
aid,
I had
registrar,
admissions, financial aid, the registrar. I had student employment.
career
We,
services,
pardon me?
career services.
Career services, the Educational Resource Center, which is our academic support center.
Right.
I had a good chunk or shared responsibility for student information systems. And we had an infrastructure to support a lot of the analytical and process work
Yeah.
that was enacted through technology. We formed a combined services unit, two combined services units, actually, at the University Service Center, which is sort of a high-level generalist, complicated triage office, and an office where we combine the front desk staffs of a number of our functional areas and tried to get a little more cross-training in that group as well. So those are the functional areas.
Yeah. So that must have been it's fascinating to think about not only the depth within each of those areas, but then how do you bring them together and integrate them as well. And it's in many cases, those are the people that face the public in a sense, and you're supervising the people that face the public.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting position to be in. It's so that kind of superstructure in which students wouldn't necessarily know what a vice president for enrollment management is, but they would know what a registrar is, for example.
Definitely. And one of the you mentioned leadership earlier, and there are different styles of leadership, none necessarily better than the other, perhaps some more suited to certain circumstances than other. Yeah. I'm not a stand out in front, and I'm not the leader that needs to be the center of attention.
Right.
And so they probably wouldn't know me. Yeah. Or necessarily what they did, but they ought to know what the organization stands for.
Yeah.
And they ought to, when they work with us, whether it's a student, a family, a colleague, they ought to expect a certain level of service, of integrity, of expertise,
right,
knowledge, of doing things well and doing the right things. And so that's, it was more about how can we work together around a certain set of shared values and goals, and that are not rooted in a person. So it's not rooted in a personality, I guess.
Right. Yes. So, and yeah, so your visibility and your impact in that role is somewhat subtle, but I would probably offer a suggestion that in the university it's the reverse in a sense, because you were very visible in the university.
Yeah.
And so in that sense you really did exemplify. You had to exemplify what the whole operation stood for. I mean, you were so often the voice at trustees meetings or deans meetings or university council and other leadership meetings. So you probably have a day to give to somebody.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we think about, we've talked about sort of line versus management, but there's more to management than running a bunch of organizations, right. Sub-organizations, and making sure they work well together and hiring good people and that kind of thing. That's all important. I don't want to set that aside, but I want to set it next to, there's a whole other part of the job, which is managing up to the board, the president, the provost, which is working with peers across the institution, with deans, yourself included, when you were dean.
Yes. The two of us knew each other quite well.
That far back.
That was wonderful.
But there's a whole other piece of the job that is about representing the organization.
Yes.
About being a stakeholder, a trusted stakeholder in critical university discussions about strategy, about crisis management, about planning for the future. And really, I think, so I'm also going to harken way back to another kind of mentor from University of Virginia, a man named Leonard Sandridge, who was essentially the number two. And he was the executive vice president, so he ran all the stuff that wasn't academic.
Right.
And his main thing is, I am a service organization.
Right. Yes.
I'm in service to the academic mission of the institution. And he would say research as well.
Yeah.
I would as well. I sort of clump them together. And that is sort of has always resonated with me, is that we are in service to the academic mission of the institution. We are not the reason institutions exist, although I would argue that without us, they wouldn't exist. But we're not the reason. And what we need to do is help the institution move along, and we need to support what they need to they need to do educationally, et cetera. And so I think trying to bring that again into the conversations with deans. I mean, I wanted them to trust me. I wanted them to work with me and know that I wasn't trying to, take over or force something on them. And I had to build that relationship and build that trust. And we did it initially by sharing information.
Yeah, which was a big deal.
It was a big deal.
Speaking on behalf of the deans in that situation, we were not accustomed to information.
It was shocking,
we were inundated with it.
It was like, my first meetings with all the deans, Jay, I don't know if you remember, but I would go in and here's your data.
Yes.
Let's open this. Let's open the book, so to speak.
And if you come to the dean's meetings a year before, people will be saying all we want is data.
Yeah.
All we want, the deans are saying all we got to do is know what's going on, how many students we're going to get, how the process works, how can we help, how can we participate, and so it was that. Yeah. So replacing that lack of transparency was in some ways, it seems so maybe in retrospect obvious and easy, but those things can be really huge. Yeah,
and I'd say sort of kind of back to the point I was making earlier, it's really another part of the job that it's in that category of and other things assigned kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's no functional area that says you need to work with deans,
right?
Or you need to, so this is part of being in that role. Run a good organization, an ethical, professional, efficient, effective organization. Yes. But also be a partner and be a peer and be a good colleague to your boss, your bosses. And I think that's, and especially, that's a piece that I think people who move into these positions don't always appreciate.
Yeah.
That how much that takes and how much a part of your job that is. And I know from people who've moved into presidencies, there's a similar leap into working with all the external constituencies, the board, donors, et cetera.
Yeah, because what I learned as a dean, which I'm sure was similar in your vice presidency, was for many people, you personify that entire operation. You're the only one they're going to meet or really get to know in that whole operation. So even if you're strictly a service operation, still they want to have confidence in you. They want to trust you. They want to believe the data you're providing. They want to believe your openness and your professionalism, et cetera. The only way they know that is through the filter that they're getting. And so even if you're trying to be kind of humble, low-key, discreet, you still have a very public responsibility.
Right. And you're right. And it's something that it comes naturally to some more than others, but you're right. It is critical. You are representing that organization. And if you're too silent, if you're too sort of invisible, then your organization isn't considered, or it's reflecting back on the organization. Why aren't they contributing here? Why don't they have something to say about this issue?
So Laurie, so looking back at all the different roles and kind of the way in which you kind of went from focus to general, back to focused again in some ways, what gave you the most satisfaction along that whole route? You know, when you're kind of looking back in retrospect, what was sort of your, you know, your I'd say happiest moment, but the most fulfilling time in a sense in that whole range of things that you've done?
Yeah, so
I'd hate to be asked that myself.
so it's not, I wouldn't say I can isolate it to a specific time or a specific role, but what makes me the happiest sort of in roles,
Right.
is I am a builder, not a maintainer.
Yes.
I like to create things.
Yeah. Okay.
I like to change things,
Yeah.
not just for change's sake, but I like to improve. I'm so that
Yeah.
though that kind of thinking, and I think it's also something we should be doing.
Yeah.
Always. But also it's work that brings organizations together for a common purpose.
What are a couple of the things that you've built or helped to build because I'm the same way. I like to have impact. I like to know that I created something that doesn't depend on me any longer, that it'll live on with somebody and let them, you know, evolve it in some way, but the satisfaction of knowing something is durable. So what are some of the things that you've done that has durability and lasting impact?
Oh dear.
I know.
I hate these.
Sorry.
So I think organizational,ally we created some units and sort of re-envisioned a couple of units within enrollment and student affairs. It's now student administration, I think. One is our combined enrollment services group. That was not an easy task. I don't know that it's 100% successful, but it's better than what we had. And so that was, even within my organization, different cultures coming together around what it meant to provide service, frontline service, cross-training, et cetera. So we built that, and that is carried on. We have some of those employees in class now, which is interesting. The other thing is that when I took over running career development and academic support, they were in horrible space. They were sort of thought of sometimes, but not always, but critically important to our students. And what we found was that some of the practices that they were using were perhaps outdated based on current standards, on demand, and what we needed to be able to do to support student success. And so we took a very deliberate approach to assessing what they were doing. We included the employees in that. It wasn't something we were doing to them. They were part of the solution. We did everything from, rebranding we changed their names, we changed their location, we gave them better space, but we also asked them to do better. And to, think strategically about how best to serve the most students. Yeah. Because that's what the central services needed to do. Yeah. They too needed to be generalists, and they too needed to be able to manage larger numbers. Yeah. So how do we do that and do that well? Yeah. So it was a very intentional.
And I had a bet with myself that you probably would pick those two things.
Funny.
But I think.
What else did you? So I would say the other thing, and I think it's kind of where my heart is now, is around college access. So I think over time, and this started the day I became vice president. I mean, it frankly started before that, but the day I became vice president, I wanted to work on being more inclusive of students who had been historically underserved by higher education.
Okay, so for me, the tough question there is, how do you reconcile a university that is not necessarily known for access and opportunity for a wide range of people, that I'll put it in the past tense, has tended to focus on students of means who come from means? how do you reconcile those different, often competing factors? Was that more of a subversive role you played or an explicit role?
Oh, that was explicit.
Yeah.
That was explicit. So part is figuring out how to make the argument to the people who can make the decision.
Right.
Right. So what maybe sounds manipulative, but it's not entirely manipulative, but how do I make the best case for change, knowing what I know about the people who are going to make the ultimate decision?
In their language, in other words.
In their language, exactly.
Yes.
And so part of it, I knew from the board, just what little I knew from the board's working, that there were members of the board who were very concerned about this topic and didn't feel like it was getting attention. I also said, it's in our own enlightened self-interest, folks.
Right. Because
guess what's coming? A radical change, a radical shift in the students graduating from high school who are going to become our students.
Yes. Yeah.
And we need to be ready for them.
Ethnically, demographically, etc.
Ethnically and economically.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
And so there's this piece of, knowing where you could garner support for that, being able to craft an argument that is that someone will respond to. Right. Will see what they need to see in the argument. Some people it's data, some people it's pathos. So some people it takes different things, but being able to make that argument that someone will listen to, and not giving up.
Not giving up. Well, and
so persistence and finding.
Yeah.
And honestly, being a woman leader, persistence sometimes is not valued. It is sometimes thought of as nagging, or being defensive.
Even with administrators.
Oh yes, yes.
I don't. Yeah.
So finding ways to consistently erode the barriers,
right,
over time, and know you're in it for the long haul.
Right. And the myopic focus is often how do we move up in the rankings? And frankly, you don't score points the same way for access and in outreach.
But you do. So here's some interesting things. So this wasn't initially, but later on.
Yeah.
During the Obama years, they were starting to look at ways of ranking institutions, grading and ranking, and ultimately ranking institutions. And one of the things they wanted to use was % of Pell participants.
Yeah, yeah.
And you better believe I told people about that.
Yes, good. Weaponize those things.
It's the right thing to do.
Right.
But again, people are going to start looking at us, and this is a list we don't want to be on.
Okay.
I know it sounds awful to say that.
Yeah.
And I sort of fear someone listening to this and thinking I'm slipping this. But I think you have to, we need to find ways of making common ground with people. And part of this, how do I get them on my side?
Yeah.
How do I get them to see things the way I see them?
And not give in to false dichotomies.
And not give in to false dichotomies, exactly.
If we're going to be A, we can't be B at the same time.
It's not a zero-sum game here.
No.
It's not.
No.
And so I think persistence and knowing you're in it for the long haul. But I started the day we joined the Posse Foundation in 2007. I had the support of the then provost to do that.
Yeah.
That was very helpful.
Yes.
Had full support. So
very important.
Yeah.
Good. So then you're upwardly mobile from being vice president to being a professor of the practice. So talk about further ascent.
The further ascent, yeah.
I'm being slightly facetious, but no, I think people often think that you step down from administration into a faculty role, and I've always felt you step up to it. But anyway,
Yeah.
So talk about that in terms of how was that transition for you, and what do you think you've brought to it and learned from it?
One thing is that it was a very deliberate choice for me, a considered choice. I talked to a lot of people of not to pursue a college presidency.
Okay.
So that was my other option, was to start. I had been in that process, and my choice was to say no to that.
Yeah. Okay, that's a big decision.
And it was a big decision because I think for me, I don't want to generalize for others, but for me, the era I grew up, my position as a female in STEM, I mean, I felt like that was the next natural step. It was almost expected that I do that. And I think it was hard for me to say, not for me.
Okay.
And at the same time, back to your question about kind of what brings you joy, or what was where are you most happy? What are you most proud of? I mean, where I had the most joy was in working with students in some of the programs that we brought on board, like Posse. So I was the Posse liaison for 10, 12 years. And I knew, I could see growth.
Right.
I could see potential realized.
Right. Very quickly, very immediately.
Very quickly and very meaningfully. And I said, we need to figure out how to do more of this. So this, I mean, it sort of became, my passion.
Yeah.
If you will. And I also, enjoyed mentoring young professionals. Right. And to be honest, that is a complete and utter surprise to me. Working, it's not high on any sort of,
You hadn't thought about it before, yeah.
Well, and I never scored high in whatever those charts were where you sort of rated what you should be when you grow up.
Yeah.
Those things did not work. I did not rate highly on those. But you move up in an organization, and guess what? That's a lot of what you do.
Yeah.
And I found that I really enjoyed working with young professionals, even starting when I was at UVA, all the way through BU, and the higher ed program seemed like a place where I could, again, make a difference, and could do some teaching, could potentially do some work around improving access and student success, that want to continue to work on a couple of ideas that I'd had that I'd never really had time to dive into. So that's that journey. That's where I am now.
Yeah. And you then moved into a director role, which in some ways is different to being an administrator. And so you're balancing teaching and leading at the same time. And
that wasn't planned.
No.
And and I think the hard thing for me has been, I can't just mail it in.
Right.
I can't. I see opportunity, and I see things I'd love for us to do better.
Right.
Or do more of. And I want to work on those things.
Yeah.
And that's a very natural space for me to slide into.
It sounds that way. You've talked about how each of the different phases were a matter of making things better, creating new things, doing things differently. So I can't imagine that you would just settle in a sense.
Yeah, and so that's, I think, part of what has been challenging is that, we're a small program. And so there's a lot that takes up a lot of my available time. outside of teaching. And I care deeply about teaching. I care deeply about teaching well.
Right.
And it's something I'm constantly learning about and practicing and finding out different ways and new ways of approaching topics and creating content and things like that. So it's taking time away from that a bit, taking a little bit of too much time away from the scholarly work I'd hope to do. So it's, you know, there's only so much time of the day, and
Right. But they'll be
we've got it. Yeah.
Okay, so to wind up a little bit, I can't, it's impossible to have this kind of conversation without talking about the pandemic and what does that all mean? And so, you know, a bit of a forum, you know, a pedestal for that, because I think it's the most, I think it's scary, fascinating, exciting. It's an amazing time that, and what's going to happen, what's already happened, it will happen next few months and next year, because it's not going to simply be, you know, cured and we're going to move back to and forget everything that's happened. It's going to be incredibly disruptive, both in the near term and I think the long term as well, at least from a macro point of view. And I tend to focus on the macro. I tend to feel how many institutions are going to survive and in what form and that sort of thing. But what's your take on this? I'm sure it blindsided you as much as it did everybody else. You know, people plan and God laughs, and it's, you know, we had no anticipation of this in some ways. No, maybe we should have.
True.
You know,
you know? So I think, unlike other crises that have faced higher education, two things. One is that we aren't alone in this. We aren't the only industry that's being turned on its head, right? Whereas other crises, it seemed like maybe higher ed was either more or less affected.
Yes.
So we're not alone. And secondarily, there isn't an aspect of what we do that this doesn't touch.
Exactly. Yes.
Not a single bit of the university.
Residence halls, every aspect.
So it is all hands on deck all the time.
Yeah.
And in my most hopeful moments, I think on a macro scale, it is forcing those of us who work at residential four-year institutions to finally grapple with and explain the value proposition.
Why should I pay this much for that?
Of being on a college campus for this much money. Yeah. And I think what this crisis has revealed is that we have failed to do that. Right. There were inklings of it, you know, in the popular press about the value of higher ed, and no one you know, why should you go, and yada yada yada. But this has put a fine point on that question.
Yeah.
And if we don't get it right, it's not that I don't think BU will go away, but we may not be able to charge $70,000, or we may have to provide multiple price points.
No.
You know?
Yeah.
So for the core, you know, educational experience. So I think it has revealed that. It also reveals that for many of us, undergraduate education is paying for a lot of stuff.
Right.
On college campuses, like graduate education.
Right.
Like research labs and things like that. So I think there's just some pulling the cloak back that this has forced.
And appreciating that more and realizing its vulnerability, that we probably thought we were invincible in many ways. Yeah. So, okay, so finally,
can I just say quickly too, I said in my hopeful points to sort of put a more micro point on it, I worry tremendously about disparate impacts of these moves and worry about losing what little progress we may have gained in closing educational gaps, not only in higher ed, but K-12. So there's that. But my most hopeful, I think it is forcing a lot of us to, I hope teaching will be better.
Yeah.
I really do. I really think it's forcing people to think about, why am I doing what I'm doing in the ways that I'm doing it?
Yes.
And how can I make it more accessible and more effective for all students?
Okay, so finally, in the age of the pandemic, what advice do you give to young people at the beginning or early on in their higher education administration career? What should they do or think about or be concerned about or look forward to as career administrators?
Well, I think some advice would be is the same regardless of the pandemic. And I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was in any job was that nothing was too small to do, to volunteer for. So if opportunities aren't handed to you, ask for them.
Right.
How can I be involved? Or here's an idea of how I can help this organization, this initiative, these students, etc. So I think regardless, initiative will always be valued. Initiative and follow through will always be valued. And I think, finding ways to make what you do matter. So connecting it to, student success. So finding ways that what you're doing is actually improving student success, or, improving certain outcomes, or et cetera, I think is important. I think the other thing is I think part of what we might be looking at are being more open to lateral moves.
Yeah.
So a lot of times moving in higher ed, we want to be moving up in an organization. There are only so many of those. There's always so many of those slots.
Right.
But I think lateral moves, different institutional types.
Yeah.
To be thinking about, again, online student support versus, on-campus student support. So ways that you can broaden, perhaps, rather than deepen your experience base, I think perhaps could open up some opportunities for change, or if heaven forbid you lose a position or are furloughed. I mean, having openness to a breadth of experiences, a breadth of institution types, student populations, functional areas, I think is going to be increasingly valuable, because we're going to have to do more with less. And the more hats you can wear, or at least the more ways of thinking you can bring to the table, or experiences you can bring to the table, the better success I think you'll have in either your current role or in whatever that next role is.
Perfect. On that note, Laurie, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And
thanks for doing this.
Okay, that's great. Take care, Laurie.
All right, bye.